All right, everyone. Thank you to our two previous speakers with a fantastic panel. Now we're moving on to our next session with our next speaker, Javal Coleman, who will be giving a paper entitled Comparative Slaveries in Ancient and Modern Contexts. Javal earned his BA in History with a minor in Classical Studies and a minor in Latin from the University of North Texas in 2020. He also earned his MA in Classics at the University of Texas in 2022. He's currently a PhD student in classics, interested in intellectual history and the history of slavery from a global perspective. When not translating Greek and Latin or reading secondary scholarship, he's preparing abstracts for conferences and looking for opportunities to connect with other scholars of color, playing video games, and most importantly, spending time with his wife and his daughter. Come on out, Javal, and let's hear about comparative slaveries.
Awesome. So I would like to thank Hannah and Joe for organizing this wonderful event, as well as my fellow panelists for just being rock stars in the field, and as well as the audience for being here. Throughout my working on this research, I have been immensely inspired by conversations with Daniel Padilla-Peralta, Jermaine Bryant, Adam Rabinowitz, David Lewis, Andrew Rigsby, and Sarah Bond. Finally, I would like to dedicate this talk to my wife and our daughter, who has insisted that her father put the books down and chase her around the house. In his book, Many Thousands Gone, The First 2 Centuries of Slavery in North America, Ira Berlin states the following concerning the lives of the enslaved, quote, "Knowing that a person was a slave does not tell everything about him or her. Slaveholders severely circumscribe the lives of enslaved people, but they never fully define them. Slaves were neither extensions of their owner's will nor products of the market's demand. The slave's history, like all human history, was made not only by what was done to them, but also by what they did for themselves," end quote. The study of the experience of the enslaved has driven much recent work in the history of slavery. The desire to understand more about the experiences, worldviews, and contingent forms of exploitation of the enslaved has also been a central driving force behind much comparative interest in the history of slavery as well. Henry Wallen, for example, in his 3-volume History of Slavery, published in 1848, examined the history of Greek and Roman slavery in order to think critically about slavery in the French colonies. This paper takes stock of the importance of comparative work in the study of slavery, what it still has to offer historians of ancient slavery, but also thinks carefully about the pitfalls of doing comparative work. I conclude by thinking about the difficulties of studying comparative slavery for the PhD student and the issues this raises with curricula. So, the comparative history of slavery has amassed a massive bibliography over the years. Pauline Smart's recent essay on comparative slavery and globalizing accounts of slavery has well documented this fact. Smart points out that one of the leading centers of this has been Slavery and Abolition, which describes itself as a journal of comparative studies. However, as Smart has rightly pointed out, the journal has primarily been interested in the comparison of, quote, the different forms of slavery that emerged from the conquest of the Americas, end quote. Perhaps the most famous Anglophone comparative history of slavery is historical sociologist Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death. And though there has been no shortage of critiques since its publication in 1982, it would be impossible to undertake important comparative work without engaging with Patterson's great book. There's also been a recent wave of important works in the study of comparative slavery for ancient historians, more works. Pauline Smart's work on the apophora system and on public slavery in Athens has rightly examined these issues in a global perspective, and Smart has also recently edited a global comparative history of slavery in French. Kostas Vlasopoulos, in his most recent book, Historicizing Ancient Slavery, engaged with slavery in other time periods and places in an extensive manner, and Joseph C. Miller's The Problem of Slavery as a History, a global approach, considers the transatlantic slave trade in a global perspective. It is important to keep in mind the disciplinary attachments of each of these scholars. Smart and Vlasopoulos are Greek historians, and Joseph Miller, a historian of transatlantic slavery. I point this out simply to say that our disciplinary attachments inherently dictate the type of comparative approach we take. This has also been supported, all of this work has been supported by numerous edited volumes that have sought to examine Greek and Roman slavery alongside other slaveholding societies. For example, Katsari and Del Lago's volume, Slave Systems, Ancient and Modern, has been illuminating, for instance, of how heritage can be understood better when compared both to the slave systems of other non-Athenian polis and to the serfdoms of modern Russia and pre-colonial Central Africa. Another more recent volume, edited by Doddington and Del Lago, called Writing the History of Slavery, probes the possibilities of taking a globalizing approach with the aim to, quote, provide a guide to how historians have used different concepts, ideas, and methodologies in their efforts at reconstructing the experience of slavery by different categories of people in different times and places throughout human history, end quote. This volume is a great introduction for any who are interested in learning more about comparative and global approaches to the history of slavery. But an ever important question raised by Kostas Vlasopoulos' 2014 article, Which Comparative Histories for the Ancient Historian, is still very much pertinent. As Vlasopoulos rightly points out, quote, ancient historians use comparative history in order to fill in the gaps of the ancient evidence, to explore similarities between areas and periods separated in time and space, to defamiliarize the familiar, or to explore how other historians have dealt with similar problems. He identifies a few essential approaches to comparative history that I will now look at more closely, as well as bring up works in the study of ancient slavery that exemplify these approaches. In terms of approaches, there's comparative history that is more focused on certain phenomena or processes through a long-term perspective. So for example, Brown and Morgan's volume on the participation of enslaved people in warfare. Rather than comparing, say, enslaved involvement in Roman warfare with its analog in the Old South, this volume shows the long history of enslaved involvement in warfare. This is an important distinction. By contrast, another comparative perspective thinks carefully about an aspect or process in antiquity alongside or with reference to a parallel process in another period or culture. This specific method is usually fueled by the frustratingly fragmentary nature of the ancient evidence. Two important recent works illustrate this approach and its application well. One, Daniel Padilla's article on slave religiosity in the Middle Roman Republic. In this article, Padilla Peralta argues that a distinct religiosity of the enslaved can be excavated from authors such as Cato and Plautus. To illustrate the payoff for thinking in these terms, he compares this enslaved religiosity with that of the Black Atlantic. Another similar approach in the study of ancient slavery comes from the work of Walter Scheidel in a series of articles on the workings of slavery production in the Roman Empire. Scheidel argues convincingly through a comparison with the antebellum American South to show that an enslaved population could reproduce itself naturally. This approach has benefited well those ancient historians who are interested in the demographics of ancient slavery, though it should be kept in mind that these approaches, like all other comparative approaches, require careful methodological considerations that often cause studies like the ones I just mentioned to come under heavy scrutiny. I would like to now turn to the analysis of the last approach Vlasopoulos mentions, something he calls, quote, more ambitious than filling in the gaps or making sense of ambiguous evidence. This, quote, involves the focused comparison of an ancient phenomena or process with the equivalent phenomena or process in one or more other periods or cultures. This type of comparison is exemplified by Walter Scheidel's work on the comparative history of the Roman and Chinese empires, for example. More specifically, in the history of slavery, there have been a few recent works that have fruitfully applied this approach. Polydis Mard, in a 2017 article in the Annales, examines the apophora system in Athens. This was a regular income paid by independently working enslaved people to their enslaver. Sometimes the enslaver would allow the enslaved to keep some of the payment if it exceeded the required amount. In the above-mentioned article, Ismart demonstrates that not only was this process similar to that of the peculium of Roman law or the Mahataba system in the Ottoman Empire, but also more significantly, that a comparison of these three shows how the systems were distinct in terms of the enslaver's liability. A forthcoming paper that I co-wrote with Padilla Peralta takes this approach and thinks carefully about the rhetorical gambits behind the discourse concerning manumission in different Greek and Roman contexts. I myself am also currently working on an article that thinks carefully about the different attributes that allowed free people to build a life for themselves. And for Comparanda, I am looking closely at slavery in 19th century Cuba. I would like to focus on this last approach a bit further and looking ahead for the study of ancient slavery and comparative slavery. One of the major issues in the field of slavery is what has been called the definitional issue. While this debate is multifaceted, I here will only mention two ends of the spectrum. On the one end is Orlando Patterson, who famously defined slavery as, quote, the permanent violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons, end quote. Thus, he concludes that the enslaved are socially dead. On the other end is David Lewis, who in his book Greek Slave Systems makes an argument for the property definition of slavery, adopting the off-sided League of Nations definition from 1926, which states that, quote, slavery is the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised, end quote. Lewis then utilizes Anthony Honoré's analysis of ownership in his 1961 article to demonstrate that the property definition still holds true. While both approaches have their merit and have been respectively critiqued, the comparative mechanism outlined just now would actually benefit this question greatly. Ismart's conception of the apophora system, for instance, alongside similar systems, has demonstrated that Athenian enslavers had an absolute sense of liability. No matter what their enslaved did or said, the law seemed to hold the enslaver responsible. This phenomenon, therefore, can provide more evidence to the property definition of slavery at Athens, since here the enslaver is wholly legally responsible for their enslaved. This paper now turns to thinking about some of the pitfalls of studying slavery from the comparative perspective for both the ancient and modern historians. One issue is that of the single case. So this is where a historian of Roman slavery sees a situation in their evidence that looks exactly like a case from slavery in the American South. Let me give a more specific example. We know that Roman slaves who ran away could be and often were hunted. We know this, for example, from late antique slave collars. We also know that in the American South, the same threat of runaways was present. So George Washington writes about Oni Judge, an enslaved woman who ran away. However, there is nothing inherently significant for pointing out both those cases as a matter of fact. It is not surprising that enslavers across different time periods would be interested in the return of their enslaved. This one-to-one comparison was much too common in earlier studies of ancient slavery and still seems to rear its head on occasion. Another pitfall of the comparative approach to slavery is scale. So, for example, if I were to do a systematic comparison of Greek manumission practices with Roman practices, that could illuminate some interesting things about the discourse concerning slavery and manumission. However, one would risk losing context and the idiosyncrasies of each system. Roman law, for instance, distinguishes between formal and informal types of manumission. Manumission by testament was a formal type that granted people freed in this way Roman citizenship, typically. On the other hand, manumission inter amicos, or among friends, was an informal type of manumission, and though it became legally recognized under Augustus, those freed this way were not given citizenship. In the Greek world, by contrast, the laws of the polis, as far as we can tell, did not make such distinctions. Those that were manumitted were simply free. Another important distinction is that Greeks that were freed were not given citizenship upon being manumitted. While this should not detract from undertaking larger scale comparative studies, it should make us aware of our own aims when undertaking this research and should lead us to be much more explicit about what we are hoping to say. The last major pitfall I would like to consider is that of expertise. Nathan Ballantyne, in his article Epistemic Trespassing, argues that, quote, epistemic trespassers judge matters outside their field of expertise. Trespassing is ubiquitous in the age of interdisciplinary research, and recognizing this will require us to be more intellectually modest, end quote. Ballantyne defines these trespassers as, quote, thinkers who have competence or expertise to make good judgments in one field, but move to another field where they lack competence and pass judgment nevertheless. David Lewis has recently pointed out that some of the most significant claims in anthropological studies on slavery have come from anthropologists who have been, quote, straying onto the turf of jurists and legal historians, end quote. Thinking more specifically about ancient slavery and history in general, we also have to confront the barriers of languages. Walter Scheidel has remarked on the issues that are raised by examining Chinese sources in translation as a Roman historian, for instance. This issue arguably does not go away unless someone is able to train as a professional in both fields. For the historian of ancient slavery, the problem is perhaps more dire because it is impossible to be equally competent in both the bibliography for, say, Athenian slavery and that of slavery in 19th century Cuba. One has to rely heavily on secondary scholarship that does know those sources well. This can also lead to historians writing histories of slavery that are grossly totalizing. Having considered some of the pitfalls of comparative history for the ancient historian, I would like to now turn to the issues that come with doing comparative history as a graduate student in classics. But it should be said at the outset, some of this will apply to graduate students more generally. The main issue for graduate students, to my mind, is expertise. I will use my own experience in graduate school to flesh this out. I first became interested in the study of ancient slavery as an undergrad when I read Keith Bradley's Slavery and Society at Rome. But I had already amassed interest in the history of slavery in the United States from my high school years. I began in my sophomore year at university feeding into a desire for the comparative history of slavery. And while it has benefited me greatly, there are some issues that have come from this. Since I have mainly focused on ancient history and classics, and I'm in a classics department, I have had to make time on top of an already demanding curriculum to engage with comparative material. On paper, while I take 3 classes a semester, it has felt like the work of 4 because of the amount of time I've spent reading more broadly across the study of slavery. This, however, is not unique to studying slavery, but can come whenever a graduate student has any kind of comparative interest. Those of us who are interested in comparative work must essentially do the work of getting 2 degrees to have any kind of real ground to stand on for comparative work. This research, however, is important and should not be abandoned. Rather, it needs to be more widely supported. Classics as a field in general has been all too good at resisting interdisciplinary work if it can. This must change. It is clear, for instance, in the social sciences that both comparative work and interdisciplinary work is much supported and even encouraged. And yet, with all these barriers, I argue that comparative work is both essential and worthwhile. I would like to conclude with just one illustration of how comparative work can yield some important results. In a recent article on manumission in Santiago de Cuba, Adriana Chira examines the process by which formerly enslaved people constructed their freed identity, first through the enslavement of others to build a family and stable home life, then by freeing others and supporting their goal to do the same. A woman named Maria de la Luz Fernandez was one of the freed individuals who benefited from this system and took it upon herself to help enslaved people. Chira states that, quote, she then participated in making similar networks that boosted other enslaved people and helped them to obtain their manumission, while also consolidating her own status as a free woman, end quote. In a similar vein, Jessica Marie Johnson engages with how formerly enslaved African women built their own definition of freedom despite the conditions that they were in upon receiving that freedom. Likewise, the Athenians Passini and Phormion, who were formerly enslaved bankers in the 4th century BCE that became rather wealthy and even Athenian citizens, used the same system that they were brought into to build their own freed identities. While it would be foolish to assume that the case of Passini and Phormion is representative of freed people in 4th century Athens, it would also be foolish to overlook the ways in which they used the different attributes that made up their status to build a freed identity for themselves. And at least in the case of Passini and Phormion, we know that other bankers used this system to enhance themselves and enslaved individuals that they trusted. This is significant because of what it tells us about how freed people could build their own lives. Turning back to the Athenian evidence then, Passini contributed to Phormion's eventual freedom and other attributes which allowed Phormion to construct a life for himself as a freed person. This included not only material wealth, but also marriage to Passion's widow Archippe, as well as the responsibility of Passion's sons. This can arguably serve as another case study of how, for example, the lives of freed people were still so interconnected with the institution that commoditized them. What I have sought to demonstrate in this paper is both the need for and importance of doing comparative work for scholars of ancient slavery, but also the need for support of this kind of work. This support can be facilitated in a number of ways. For me, this has taken the form of mentoring for more experienced scholars in the field who continue to undertake comparative work. This, however, also needs to be supported by implementation of interdisciplinary work in the shaping of the classics graduate curricula. Comparative work, I'd argue, is not only important, but necessary, especially for those of us who are not satisfied with a simple pose of righteous indignation at the fragmentary nature of our evidence for the enslaved. Thank you.